Within seconds of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese dive bombers and Zero fighters struck Hickam Field and Eva Marine Air Station. Again, the dive bombers targeted hangars, and the fighters strafed and destroyed rows of American planes on the runways. The coordinated attack on Battleship Row continued minutes later with the release of bombs from the high-altitude bombers. These exploding bombs started huge fires on board the ships, which quickly ignited floating oil on the harbor from the ruptured battleships. Battleship Row was a blazing inferno, engulfing everything within its reach, other ships and sailors attempting to swim to safety. 4 armor-piercing bombs hit the USS Arizona, one penetrating the ship and exploding 3 decks below. This detonation ignited 100 tons of black powder in the interior of the ship. The resulting explosion broke the battleship in half and sent a column of fire and red smoke 1,000 feet in the air. Within 8 minutes of the first bomb strike, the Arizona lay on the floor of Pearl Harbor. 1,177 officers, sailors, and Marines went down with the Arizona that Sunday morning, making this attack the worst single disaster in U.S. naval history. In the middle of this ferocious attack, the 11 American B-17 bombers from California arrived at Oahu. They were scheduled to land at Hickam Field, but as they approached the airfield, they became additional targets for the Zeros. 3 crash-landed at Hickam. Others sought alternative landing sites, one setting down on the Kahuku Golf Course in northern Oahu. The 18 scout planes from the USS Enterprise also arrived at Pearl Harbor at this time. 5 were shot down by Japanese fighter planes, and a 6th was lost to U.S. anti-aircraft fire, one of several tragic friendly fire incidents to occur that day. By the time the Japanese second wave reached Oahu, the attack was no longer a surprise. This formation of planes flew down the eastern coast of the island before separating into small groups to strike Pearl Harbor from the south and from the north. This wave would have a little different strategy. This time, the high-altitude bombers would strike the airfields, and the dive bombers would hit the ships in Pearl Harbor. The success of the first wave actually made this mission a bit more difficult and more dangerous for the Japanese. The black, thick smoke rising from the crippled battleships along Battleship Row made targets harder to find, and American forces were now responding with anti-aircraft fire. This wave would lose 20 aircraft to American resistance, compared to only 9 losses in the first wave. During a slight lull in the fighting between the 2 attack waves, the USS Nevada, despite suffering torpedo damage, started to pull away from Battleship Row. It was making a run for the entrance to Pearl Harbor and the open ocean. A cheer went up from the sailors fighting fires on the many stricken ships. The cheers were cut short when the dive bombers of the second wave saw the Nevada moving and swooped down to stop her. The ship took at least 5 direct hits. To avoid the possibility of being sunk in the channel and blocking the entire harbor, she was purposely run aground at Hospital Point. The dive bombers then turned their attention to other ships in the harbor. In Dry Dock Number 1, they found and struck the battleship USS Pennsylvania and the destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs. Bombs ignited fires on the destroyers. The fires detonated onboard depth charges and torpedoes, sinking both ships. In Floating Dry Dock Number 2, dive bombers concentrated on the destroyer USS Shaw. These bomb strikes eventually ignited gunpowder in the ship's forward magazines. The resulting explosion rocked Pearl Harbor and sent a fireball into the air that was visible for miles. At Hickam Field and Kaneohe Naval Air Station, high-level bombers destroyed hangars and surface facilities. Zeros also strafed the runways, targeting airplanes and anything else that moved. 3 American fighter planes tried to get into the air from Bellows Field. 8 Zeros swept over the runway and shot down all 3 planes. However, At Wheeler Field, 6 P-36 fighters did get airborne and broke up an approaching air raid. By 10 o'clock a.m., the Japanese assault was over. The attacking planes had all retreated to their carriers, leaving in their wake an incredible swath of carnage. 21 of the 185 vessels in Pearl Harbor had been sunk or seriously damaged. 188 airplanes had been destroyed and another 159 damaged on Oahu's 6 airfields. But more significantly, 2,390 had lost their lives in the attacks, and another 1,178 were wounded. Nearly half of this death toll was accounted for by the sinking of the Arizona. These casualties also included civilians. Some were working at Pearl Harbor. The majority were from the downtown Honolulu area. A shower of unexploded anti-aircraft shells fell to earth. Many detonated on impact, causing property damage, injuries, and most of the 49 civilian fatalities that day. With the departure of the second wave, American forces had time to regroup and brace for what might come next. It wasn't long before rumors started flying. The Japanese had landed troops on the North Shore as the first of an invasion force and were moving overland. False reports of water supplies being poisoned and of enemy paratroopers were coming in from all parts of Oahu. Needless to say, everyone was on edge. This edginess led directly to a final friendly fire incident. That afternoon, the Enterprise's scout planes, bombers, and fighters were in the air, looking for the Japanese carriers. All planes returned to the Enterprise that evening, except 6 F-4F fighter planes that went on to land at Ford Island. The control tower had advised all ships that American planes were incoming, but once the planes were spotted, the entire harbor began shooting. 4 of the F-4F fighters were shot down, killing 3 American pilots. By this time, the Japanese carrier strike force was 500 miles northwest of Oahu, on a course for home, having, in a 2-hour time span, introduced to the United States and the world the era of the aircraft carrier and its pivotal role in modern warfare.